Before we get started, I've got to let you guys know something. I don't talk much about myself on the podcast because 1, you're all here for the history, not for my boring story, and 2, I'm just naturally introverted. But sometimes real life hits hard and affects everything. Long story short, this month, which is July of 2023, I have to have a mastectomy. It's a very physical and emotional thing for me, and I thought about not mentioning it at all. But then I thought maybe it would be helpful to be a little more transparent, especially if anyone listening has had a loved one go through the same thing, or even had to go through something similar themselves. So I decided to be vulnerable and let you guys know what was going on. I thought about trying to just continue putting out episodes during recovery, but I also know that would be super overwhelming in a situation that's already overwhelming. Last year, I took a break for a couple episodes around August or so. This year, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll upload old, remastered episodes from the archives for the next 3 episodes, because I can't just leave you guys with nothing. While I'm taking this time off, I'm going to freeze my Patreon account, like I did last year, because I don't think it's right for me to charge my patrons while I'm not putting out new content. I will try to continue posting a Patreon-only feed, and will also try to stay as active as I can on Instagram. I'm sorry I have to take this time away, but I will be back. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy your summer, or winter for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, let's get away from all this depressing stuff and into some history. I hope you'll enjoy the show. Here we go. In the darkness of an early May morning, 1941, a German battleship was launched. At the time, it was the largest the world had ever seen, a behemoth of a battleship, and the crown jewel of Hitler's navy. It had a displacement, or weight, of 53,000 tons, which for scale was around a ton more than the Titanic weighed. About half of that weight was made up of protective armor, which is part of what made this ship so formidable. It had thick anti-aircraft armor, carried 4 float planes, and a crew of 2,065. Though 2,200 were on board when it was first spotted by Britain's Navy on the 24th of May, 1941. This wasn't just any battleship. This was the Bismarck, and its fate was sealed in a nautical chase so epic it's still remembered in song, stage, and screen. We'll get into the chase and the outcome of the now historic naval battle between Germany and Britain. But what we're really after in this episode isn't as much the maritime history of the Bismarck itself, its thick armor, aircraft, or its hefty guns, but its cat. His name was Sam, at least it eventually was, and his story is legendary. Today, we'll explore why he has gone down in history as the Unsinkable Sam. I'm your host, Kristen Robine Terpstra, and this is the History Cache. Let's have a look inside. The sources we have on the Unsinkable Sam aren't great. There is even speculation that this cat was actually a couple of different cats. And some doubt he was on the Bismarck at all because there was no official record of him having been on board. Some speculate this might mean he was a stowaway, a cat that had slipped on board the giant ship before it embarked, or even someone's unregistered pet. There's also some debate surrounding the surviving images we have of Sam. One is a drawing by an unknown artist, another is a pastel drawing by a known artist, Georgina Shaw Baker, that sits in the National Maritime Museum of Greenwich, though it is not currently on display. There are a couple surviving photographs of a black and white cat fitting Sam's description that are sometimes attributed to him, but it's hard to verify if they're really of Sam. In one of them, if you zoom in and look at the collar, it clearly says HMS Amethyst, 1949. Sam was never on the Amethyst, but another famous cat named Simon was. He even received a medal for his service, which included surviving injuries from shrapnel and taking care of a rather nasty rat infestation. When he was buried, it was with full military honors. So that photo's probably not of Sam. It would be easy to mistake Sam for another cat, since there were actually quite a few cats who rose to fame in times of war. According to Time, a cat named Tiddles logged more than 30,000 miles during their service. On the HMS Prince of Wales, another black and white cat, which sometimes gets mistaken for Sam, had his photo taken with Winston Churchill. So we should take Sam's story with a grain of salt, but there is still the possibility it's all true. Having cats aboard warships was not uncommon. They helped keep rodents at bay, which could damage wood, ropes, electrical wiring, and cause any number of other issues. These cats also helped to boost morale, an important task during wartime. The ships Sam was purported to be on were all real and extremely well documented, and they did sink in the order given for his story. So I'm going to tell Sam's story as it stands now, which includes several big historic events. Even if it is apocryphal, it's still an incredible tale about a cat who came very close to using all 9 of his lives at once, several different times. It seems the biggest issue historians have with Sam is his involvement with the Bismarck, where he was first discovered. That is where we'll begin. In 1941, the Bismarck was carving through the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic on a top-secret mission to sink Allied convoys passing through the Atlantic between the US and Britain. According to History Extra, between January and May of 1941, German U-boats had sunk 277 British and Allied merchant ships, totaling nearly 1.5 million tons of supplies. To protect these merchant ships targeted by Nazi forces, they were put into convoys, where they could be escorted safely to port. The giant, well-gunned, and well-armored Bismarck set out to destroy those convoys. They were full of essential cargoes like oil and food, and Nazi leaders believed sinking them would cut the link between Britain and its overseas allies, essentially starving an already strapped UK. This was obviously a serious problem for Britain, and as soon as the Royal Navy heard the Bismarck was running amok in the Atlantic, they immediately began searching for it. Within the fleet sent out to find the Bismarck was the HMS Hood, the largest warship Britain had at the time. It had been launched in 1918, and despite its fame, it wasn't as modernized as the brand new German Bismarck. According to the BBC, the HMS Hood was accompanied by the HMS Prince of Wales, and they were heading to Iceland, trying to intercept the German Bismarck, as well as Germany's Prince Eugen, which were both trying to break out into the Atlantic through the Denmark Straits. 2 other cruisers, the Norfolk and Suffolk, were already in the area. They had already spotted the Bismarck and were following at a safe distance, waiting for the other ships to arrive. On the Bismarck, the radar system was damaged, which, as luck would have it, made it impossible for the Germans to know there was a Royal Navy fleet heading their way. At 6 a.m., early, on May 24th, 1941, the British ships decided it was time to approach at full speed. When it was 14 miles away, the HMS Hood was the first to fire shots at the Bismarck. The shells missed their target, slamming into the water at 1,000 miles per hour, causing huge pillars of salt water to gush up from the ocean. After initially freezing with indecision, the Bismarck returned fire. At the same time, Germany's Prince Eugen concentrated its own guns on the Hood. The World War I era hull of the HMS Hood was overwhelmed by the new World War II shells from the German ships hitting their mark. First, the deck was hit. The heavy shells tore right through the armor, protecting the Hood's ammunition magazine. This caused a mammoth explosion, with fire reaching upwards of 600 feet into the air. After that, the HMS Hood could take no more. The old battleship split in two, then sank to the bottom of the sea. Only 3 of its 1,421 crew members were recovered alive. With the Hood gone, the guns were turned on the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. This vessel was able to return fire and hit the Bismarck twice. But the Prince of Wales was hit as well, and the chase was temporarily halted as the Royal Navy backed off to shadow from a safer distance and call for help. The Bismarck was not unscathed. After the first fight, it was leaking oil and taking on some seawater, which flooded a boiler room. The Bismarck wanted to retreat from the fray rather than continue its fight, so it could limp into a port in Nazi-occupied France for repairs. The British did everything they could to take advantage of the injured Bismarck before it could reach safety. 100 miles away, HMS Victorious, an aircraft carrier, sent out planes for an airstrike. Its swordfish pilots met the Bismarck after flying through a rainy night full of low-hanging clouds. One of their torpedoes hit its mark and caused more flooding, which cost the Bismarck another boiler. The Royal Navy lost sight of the Bismarck in the early morning hours of the 26th, 2 days after it had been initially spotted, and the German behemoth was now less than 1 day away from finding a safe port. Desperate to sink its foe, the Royal Navy sent out another airstrike, but its swordfish accidentally fired on one of Britain's own ships. Thankfully, no damage was done, but time was lost. Again, the British sent out another airstrike, and this time they found their mark. 2 swordfish pilots hit the Bismarck, with one shot ripping a hole in the stern, the other damaging the steering gear, which jammed the ship's rudder. After this, all the Bismarck could do was sail in circles. Not wanting to risk friendly fire, the British held off until morning. Then, the morning of May 27th, several British battleships began firing. They shot nearly 3,000 shells at the floundering Bismarck. At approximately 10:20 a.m., the HMS Dorsetshire was sent in to finish off the wounded battleship, firing a torpedo into each of the Bismarck's sides. The German ship could not maneuver to safety, or retaliate to any real degree after the attacks of the previous night. Shortly after the Dorsetshire was sent in, the Bismarck, defeated, was beneath the waves. Just like that, the crown jewel of Hitler's navy was dead in the water less than 10 days after it had taken to sea. The Royal Navy began pulling survivors from the flotsam spilling out of the wrecked Bismarck. Of the 2,200 crew members on the Bismarck, 116 were rescued. There was something else picked up that day with the human survivors. Among the floundering German crew was a black and white cat clinging to refuge on a plank floating across the water. Legend says it was the crew of the HMS Cossack that pulled him from the sea. They didn't know his name, they didn't know his story. None of that mattered anyway, because now he was Oscar, and this German cat was changing sides. He was now a member of the British HMS Cossack, and his legend was just getting started. You might be thinking, hold on, this is a podcast about a cat named Sam. Who is this Oscar guy? His original name is lost to history. No one knows what he was called while he was on the Bismarck, at least not that I could find. And his name would change one more time before he found his way into the annals of history. Since the sailors on Britain's HMS Cossack didn't know his name, they called him Oscar, because that was the code word used when someone went overboard. Whoever he was before, he was Oscar now, and he was employed with the Royal Navy. That alone would be a great ending, but Oscar's adventures weren't even close to being finished. According to the HMS Cossack Association, there were 6 different HMS Cossacks over the years. Oscar was on number 5. This destroyer was completed in 1938 and had seen plenty of action even before it was involved in sinking the Bismarck. But this ship's life, unlike Oscar's, was unfortunately short-lived. In October of 1941, only 5 months after rescuing Oscar, the Cossack was hit with a torpedo fired by a German U-boat. It took 4 days for the ship to sink, and when it did, 159 of its crew were lost. But not its cat. This was Oscar's second battleship sinking, and again, he survived. He was transferred to an aircraft carrier called the HMS Ark Royale. This ship had 2 hangar decks, which held enough room for 72 planes. According to the Naval Encyclopedia, that had been, until that point, unheard of. But this was World War II, and technology was moving quickly. Soon, planes were bigger and heavier, and the number of planes on board went down to 60. HMS Ark Royale had also been involved in the chase for the Bismarck. 15 swordfish planes had attacked the Bismarck from the hangars on the HMS Ark Royale. It was after being picked up by this ship that Oscar was renamed Sam. Not many people can say they survived 2 ship sinkings, let alone a cat. Sam's story does remind me of Violet Jessup, who has appeared on this podcast before. She can be found in the episode entitled Historic Oddities Part 1, Frank Hayes, the Unsinkable Violet Jessup, and Jack the Incredible Baboon. Jessup was involved in 3 different shipwrecks, including the Titanic, and survived all 3. Her story unfolded decades before Sam was even born, but they would have made a great pair. Sam had to grow accustomed to his new ship while it was actively on duty. After aiding in sinking the Bismarck, the HMS Ark Royale worked as an escort, leading Allied convoys to Malta, which meant by this point, Sam was one of history's most well-traveled felines. His voyaging on this new ship was to be short-lived, however, because in November of 1941, less than a month after mousing on the HMS Ark Royale, the aircraft carrier, which had seen so much action during its service, was torpedoed by a German U-boat. The aircraft carrier broke in 2 before sinking, and joining both of Sam's previous ships, the Bismarck and the HMS Cossack, at the bottom of the sea. This time, there was only 1 casualty, and it wasn't Sam. He had just survived his 3rd wartime shipwreck, cashing in 3 of his 9 lives within the span of 1 year. Now they called him Unsinkable Sam. It was agreed that it was time for him to retire. We don't know if that was because he was getting a reputation for bringing bad luck on board whatever ship he happened to be sailing on or not. But Sam didn't have the best track record at sea, and it's no wonder that, for whatever reason, they thought it was high time for him to try some mousing on land. According to an article from All That's Interesting by Natasha Ishak, the remainder of Sam's life was much more comfortable than his tenure at sea. First, he was placed in the offices of the governor of Gibraltar, According to the National Maritime Museum of Greenwich, sometime after that, he was sent to a seaman's home in Belfast. This is where Sam spent the remainder of his days. He lived in retirement for a full decade after the war ended, passing away in 1955. The last half of his life was much less adventurous than the first half, and I'd say he more than earned a spot in a peaceful home for sailors, even if parts of his story are apocryphal, which, again, we don't really know if they are. But even if Sam's place in history is a sea story, his legend remains just as he was, unsinkable. Thank you so much for listening to the show today and sharing your time with me. I hope you enjoyed hearing all about the legend of the incredible, unsinkable Sam. Huge shout out to my newest patron, James. James, your support means so much, and your awesomeness knows no bounds. I am sorry you signed up right before I'm freezing my Patreon, but I will be back. Again, the next 3 episodes will be from the cache as they were last year around this same time. Again, I will try and stay as active as I can. Even though I'm freezing patron payments because nothing new is coming out, I still hope to post some stuff, so keep an eye on the Patreon feed. For everyone else, I'll still be checking my email and posting some stuff on Instagram. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at historycashpodcast@gmail.com. Background music is licensed through Envato Elements. Stay safe, stay smart, stay curious, and until we meet again, my dear friends, go make some history.